Frank Furedi is the executive director of Matthäus Corvinus Collegium in Brussels and emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent. He's a prominent sociologist and author of more than 25 books, and he's joining me from Brussels. Thanks for agreeing to talk to us.
Nice to talk to you, Stefan.
Most people see democracy in Europe being endangered by the rise of populism in EU member states, and they'll look at Italy or Hungary or your homeland. You, by contrast, see the danger emanating from Brussels. You wrote, I quote, that illiberal anti-populism constitutes the principal threat to democracy in Europe. Why?
Well, it depends on your definition of populism, how you see populism. And in general, in the literature, populism has got a negative connotation to it. Myself, I see populism historically as a demand for a voice, a demand to be taken seriously. It's a democratic aspiration because people often feel that their interests, their views are being neglected, and therefore they basically are moving against the mainstream parties who've taken them for granted for a very long time. Now, the European Union, and in particular its Commission and its bureaucracy, represents the very antithesis of this, because they seem to believe that they know better than the people what's in their best interests. And unlike institutions in the past that responded to what people wanted, so basically their reforms would be an attempt to meet the needs of the people, most of the EU policies are dreamt up in Brussels. They're not a reaction or a response to a demand from the population. They think that this is what Europe needs. They think that this is what the people of Europe need. And that arrogant, paternalistic sensibility, I think, leads to the thwarting of democracy, because they have a very strong, what we call anti-majoritarian sensibility. They think that the masses, the citizens in general, are not intelligent enough to deal with what they think are difficult or complex problems. You need to be sitting in the Commission office in Brussels to be able to do that.
But that is then also linked to our understanding of democracy, right? And your critics would say that democracy is not simply the rule of a majority, right? It is a rule of a majority, but that is constrained by a strong commitment to the rule of law state. And what the European Union and the European Commission in particular, as the guardian of the treaties, do is to ensure that the countries like Hungary comply with these demands, right? So what's wrong with that?
Well, several things. I think that democracy is obviously not a simple issue, but the point that we all have to agree on is that the rule of the majority is the first order principle. So we have to be committed to the fact that in the end, the majority gets to decide the future direction of its community. And that's really important. It's not experts, it's not people who are in the judiciary, it's the decision of the people that should come first. Now, obviously, in any society, you need to have checks and balances. You need to basically make sure that decisions are not taken too hastily. You have to be in a position where you have a situation where there's a judiciary, lawmakers who are and law interpreters who are able to, in a sense, deal with the new questions that are thrown up. But these are interpretations of laws that are made by parliaments, and the parliaments are decided by the majority. Now, it seems to me that this is the way it ought to be. And I think what the European Union has done is it's basically tried to undermine the democratic aspirations of those nations like Hungary, which have a different outlook on the world than it has, by trying to sort of nitpick and find things there which is called and anti-democratic. So if you take the example you used, I don't think that the rule of law in Hungary is any worse than the rule of law in Belgium, where I am. So for example, just the other week we organized a conference called the NatCon Conference, National Conservative Conference, and 3 mayors in Brussels tried to ban those conferences and closed it down. And in the end, we managed to sort of get the conference done, but only after the Prime Minister of Belgium was forced to intervene and say that this is unconstitutional. But he only said that it's unconstitutional because he was under a lot of pressure. For example, the Prime Minister of Britain indicated that this is this is a scandal, what's happening in Brussels. Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, said the same thing. Now, in Hungary, whatever you think about it, you don't ban meetings. I don't know of any single meeting, political meeting, organized by the opposition that has its venue taken away. So there's a real double standard about the rule of law. And between you and me, I take the independence of judiciary seriously, but I cannot think of a single country where that judiciary independence is not violated by politicians in some shape or form. And therefore, there's always a tension between the judiciary and the political domain. And I think the EU is unaware of that or is weaponizing that. So I reject the claim that somehow they're morally above what's happening in other societies.
But so, I mean, the example you use, of course, others would point out that in the end, it did work out in your favor, right? And therefore, the rule of law state prevailed. But I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty of that argument. No. What interests me is going back to that understanding of democracy, right? There's the rule of the people. And I think it's hard to disagree with your point that fundamentally, majority view matters a great deal. But then the question is, whose majority? And the proponents of an ever closer union argued that Europe or European citizens also constitute, potentially at least, a demos, right? And the majority of Europeans might be quite opposed to what's happening in Hungary. I mean, you wrote about it. You wrote a monograph about what you described as European culture wars, right? And the subheading of that study from 2017 is the conflict of values between Hungary and the EU. But my question is about what constitutes an ideal size of a political unit, in your view? Is democracy still to be located within nation states, or could it be moved to a European level?
Well, historically, many philosophers used to argue that the city-state, like in Athens, historically, was about the right place for democracy to work, because there you had people who knew each other, were accountable to each other, and it was relatively easy to manage the debates and the discussions that were being had. I think the nation-state is probably the biggest unit within which you can realistically talk about a demos, a people, and realistically talk about citizens that have a certain degree of attachment to their community and culture and to each other. Anything beyond that does not work. So I think the idea of a European demos is an absurd abstraction that makes very little sense, because in a sense, what you're talking about are people whose relationship to one another, whose loyalties is non-existent. And I think the main purpose of trying to create a European demos is to undermine and ultimately destroy the workings of national sovereignty, because you have to remember that the key debate in the EU is between federalism, which has got a very strong imperial ambition, and national sovereignty, the inviolability of national independence. And we have to decide in the 21st century, despite its globalist character, what do we think is the best way of giving democracy meaning? And I think it's through the nation state rather than anywhere else.
But so going back then again to that discussion about the rule of law. So we agreed and we established that the rule of majority matters, but I assume that you wouldn't challenge the view that the protection of minorities is also important. And again, I mean, there are horrible historical examples in Europe, right, where majority ended up oppressing minorities, or even going to the US. Alexis de Tocqueville famously warned against the tyranny of majority. So what do you think about the importance of protecting minorities, including in countries like Hungary, where critics would argue that not just ethnic minorities, but say minorities based on their self-described gender, etc., feel oppressed. And there, then the EU law would matter as protecting those rights that they have through their membership.
Yeah, I'm always very suspicious of external, forces protecting citizens of a nation from their own government. It's to me usually an argument for regime change or intervention. And I think that the role of minorities in a society is really important to take seriously and to protect. And I think that, for example, in East Europe, when I look at its history, I always say that you can judge an East European country by the way it treats Jewish people and Roma people, because they've been the historic minorities there. And on that account, Hungary is exceptionally advanced in the lead, I would say. There's no other country, in fact, in Europe where anti-Semitism is fought and marginalized so systematically. I think that when it comes to debates about identity groups, which is what you're talking about, the situation is more complex because in every society, for example, questions about transgender, the role of transgender people, the rights that they should have, is continually debated. Should they be able to change their names, their sex? Should their children under the age of 21 or 18 or 16 be able to change their gender? Should we basically argue that transgender people get to decide how other people see them? These are very kind of complicated questions. And all that I would say is that, for example, in Hungary, what you have is a very strong commitment to the distinction between the private and the public sphere, so that whatever your sexual orientation is, you're completely free to pursue it and live in accordance with your values. For example, in Budapest, and you have a very flourishing gay scene, gay clubs and everything else. People don't get beaten up. There isn't any problems on that score. What there is, and this is the debate between the EU and Hungary, are fundamental differences between whether or not children at the age of 5, 6, 7, and even older ought to be exposed to discussions about different types of gender identities, which I would say is the business of the parents to teach those things rather than of anybody else. But more importantly, there's a different way in which transgender ideals in particular are perceived. And I think Hungary's got the right to have its own opinion on issues that were beyond discussion until about 10 years ago everywhere in Europe.
But so that goes to the heart of what you extensively kind of debated in your book on European culture wars. But the difficulty there is that once a country is within the European Union, once a country is a part of the European Union, it has to comply with EU laws, right? And so that for example, transgender rights, that has a kind of political, even ethical dimension to it that can be and is robustly debated within European societies. But there is also a legal dimension to it, right? And that is what then the European Commission, for example, is entitled to protect those rights when it finds a basis for them within EU treaties, etc. Right? So how can one disentangle these legal dimensions from political or moral dimensions?
So I think that even the EU Commission recognizes that under the present legislation, it hasn't got the right to basically, it's not part of its brief to determine matters to do with people's personal life and matters to do with the relationship between schools and children. That's not part of their brief at all. They know that. So what they try to do is to pressurize a nation like Hungary by introducing what they call gender mainstreaming, which essentially means that if you want to get any money from the EU, for example, if you're a Hungarian or a Polish theater and you're asking for money, then as part of your application form, you got to indicate that you're going to uphold and celebrate diversity and LGBTQ plus kind of values. and that's got to be, sort of integral to your mission as a theater. Now, that to me, basically what it does is it weaponizes the law that it introduces to bring about cultural change in a nation that's meant to be an independent nation that should have the right to determine its cultural forms, because when the EU was formed, it used to be an EU of nations, of independent sovereign nations. And it was assumed that EU was also a kind of a group of nations with different cultures. In fact, the nice thing about Europe has been its cultural diversity between different nations. Now, if you're going to impose and try to create this homogeneous orientation towards very intimate dimensions of personal life, I think that you are having almost like a quasi-totalitarian impulse playing itself out in a way that the EU itself recognizes it hasn't got the right, certainly not yet.
Well, what you describe also is reflected, I suppose, in this awkward institutional setting of the European Union, right? It is accepted that the member states remain the masters of the treaties, right? And the Commission only plays the role of the guardian of the treaties, and whether that Commission sometimes overstretches its role. I mean, for critics of the Commission, they say they don't do enough to stop what is often described as democratic backsliding, not just in Hungary, but in Poland until recently, and in Slovakia, my homeland, right now. But so we have talked a lot about what is wrong with the EU. Would you tell me anything that you find is wrong with Hungary? I mean, there is a problem with one political party, one prime minister, however well he reflects the desires of the Hungarian people, being in charge for so long.
I think there are two problems in Hungary that I worry about, maybe three. One of them is that historically, since the election of the last Orban regime, when you had the scandal and the collapse of the Socialist Party occurring, the opposition in Hungary has been uniquely weak and feeble. And you can't even call it an opposition, except they're more like angry children that kind of lash out. And instead of forming a serious political alternative, what you have is a group of individuals jockeying for power, and you have the invention of new parties almost overnight, and then they disappear, and then new parties being created. So that has meant that there is no opposition in the way that I understand it, an effective opposition in Hungary. There are people who are opposed to the government in parliament, but they don't have a political alternative that I would say as being serious. And a democratic society needs to have an opposition. So the problem for me is not that the prime minister has been in existence and has been re-elected time and again. The problem for me is that for democracy to really flourish, you need a debate, a culture of debate, arguments. You need to hold a government to account. So that's, for me, problem number one. Problem number two, nobody talks about this because everybody is busy talking about LGBTQ rights and the violation by the government. To me, the biggest problem in Hungary is rural poverty, which I think is for me a huge issue. And because it's a social issue rather than a cultural issue, nobody talks about it on either side. But that's something that I'm really deeply concerned about, and it's very important to address. The government has done certain things that are quite good, particularly with the Roma people who are in a better position than they were before they were elected. So that's the second problem. The third problem that I worry about is corruption. And I think that, unfortunately, corruption is endemic throughout Europe. We see that in Belgium and elsewhere, and in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. But I do think that the whole existence of corruption, which is in many ways a reaction and a legacy to the communist Soviet regime, is to me a very important, possibly the number one problem to tackle.
Now, you have established your reputation in Brussels now as a very eloquent and fearsome critic of the European project. I'm glad also that you share with us your concerns about Hungarian democracy. But then the obvious question is, what is the way out? What is your kind of vision for Europe that would be closer to your understanding of democracy?
I think that my job in Brussels, in a very modest way, is to challenge the dominant narrative that the EU projects to the whole of Europe. I think we need to have an alternative narrative taken seriously, not shut down. I think at the moment there's a constant attempt to pathologize the kind of views that I have. I often get called far right by EU sort of activists, which I don't really understand. I mean, far right historically has meant authoritarian, anti-democratic, racist. I mean, a number of things that it was associated with. So there's an attempt to shut down discussion. There's a huge problem that should concern everyone, not just my side or me or others, but everybody, which is Europe has become as polarized now, particularly in the EU, as America. People only talk to people like themselves. There's no room for debate. I mean, the idea that I could have friends on the left and the right and go out drinking, which is what I used to do, when I was younger, is just not on. People would think that's bizarre. So for me, the way to reintroduce democracy, and it's a huge problem, is to create a culture of debate to kind of, sort of prevent a situation where people can be shut down and quarantined and pathologized, and try to find areas where you can get people to come together. So one of the things I'm doing in Brussels is I'm encouraging people from what I call the old left or the old school left to both work with me and my organization, but also discuss and debate, because at least the old left, the old social democratic left, is very different than the identity oriented left that's in the ascendancy at the moment. So try to build bridges between anybody that's open-minded. Myself, I consider myself a classical liberal. People think I'm kind of old-fashioned conservative, but I'm classical liberal. I'm a free speech absolutist. I don't expect others to necessarily embrace my view, but I do hope that people can see the value of discussion and debate, because that is the foundation on which a democratic society can be built.
Thank you. That's a very nice way to finish our conversation, because this is very much what is at the heart of this massive open online course, to open up a debate about different visions for Europe. Professor Frank Furedi, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks very much. Yeah.